I'd like to give a little bit of personal story because this panel really is quite personal to me and very exciting and a huge privilege. I first discovered Dr. Sims when I was essentially getting certifications in order to prepare myself to write workout programming for female TAC athletes. And when I was looking for that nuanced approach, I found her material online, I found her viral TED Talk, and I said, this is exactly what VP's been waiting for in terms of a nuanced approach for women's biology and physiology. So Stacy, you've basically been a piece of VP from the beginning, whether you realize it or not. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with the world, and I'd like to invite you to quickly introduce yourself.
Thanks. Dr. Stacy Sims, I am a female athlete performance physiologist. Basically, I've been doing research in sex differences in training and nutrition for my entire academic and sporting career. I too grew up as an Army brat and have a close kin to military and tactical athletes. And my mantra is women are not small men, because almost everything we know about training protocols, testing has been based on male data, including rehabilitation, including biomechanical assessments. It's all based on algorithms that are based on male data. And myself, PhD students, and other small groups across the world are really fighting to change that and really pushing to have women be empowered with their own physiology to be able to maximize their own performance.
Well, thank you for that. It's also my pleasure to introduce my fitness coach, Michael Ban. I discovered Michael actually shortly after having a couple knee surgeries in 2020 and really wanted some individualized help in rebounding and coming back to full operational capacity. And Michael has been my coach ever since then. He's a world-class tactical athlete coach that's lectured all over the world and has worked with a broad variety of individuals. And I'm happy to host you here.
Thanks.
Please tell us about you a little bit.
Yeah, I'm Michael, and I have a master's degree in kinesiology, where my real concentration, or my fascination really, is human puzzles and trying to figure out why humans don't adapt to the program. Because I've seen so many people just do random stuff and succeed, and then I've seen people be super dialed in and fail. So I got really fascinated with what stops adaptations, and that led me down a big functional medicine and naturopathic medicine rabbit hole, where I started to look at blood work, urine hormone testing, stool testing, especially for those who have deployed, because if you drink some of the tap water overseas, you're not going to have a great time. And but that impacts everything, right? Like that gut health, it's a buzzword, but you just Google gut health and muscles, and there's a gut muscle axis. And so I really dug into why people don't adapt to the program, and instead of trying to snowflake programs, let's take away the thing that's preventing the adaptation and then give them a new stimulus so that way they can get better. And that's kind of where I found a lot of my success.
Great, thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I'll set the tone a little bit by making the observation that a number of branches in recent months and in the last couple of years have instigated holistic approaches to fitness and mental health and spiritual wellness. The Army has holistic health and fitness. I know the Air Force and Navy have also implemented similar programs. And the overarching goal with these programs is to create more of an individualized approach for the airman, the sailor, the Marine, the soldier. Typically what we'd seen in the past, and I'm sure a lot of people will nod knowingly after saying this, but in the past, the most cost-effective thing has been group training. Everybody in the company does the same PT, and it was often led by someone that might not be specifically trained or understand or appreciate individual needs. It's just like, we're doing this thing, we're all doing the same workout because that's the way it's got to be. And so I think it's certainly commendable that the branches of service are moving away from that model and moving more towards how do we approach the individual. But of course, in the context of this conversation, it's important to acknowledge really a lack of what I would say is awareness and education on how female biology and physiology not only impacts training and ability to improve in readiness, but really how that can be optimized for the best performance possible. I feel like in a lot of the conversations we have around women, especially in the military and entering into these tier 1 jobs and special operations, there's a whole lot of talk about what women can't do. But what's exciting to me is that we don't really know the full potential that we do have, because there's a lot of misinformation or really lack of information on What if we work in conjunction with female hormonal cycles to optimize in those times when it's great to optimize and reinforce when it's time to reinforce? So with that backdrop, I would like to pose the first question for Stacy. Stacy, what do you see as the biggest blind spots when it comes to training female tactical athletes?
I think one of the biggest things is that women don't even understand their own menstrual cycle, and they don't understand what an oral contraceptive pill could do or an IUD. So if we're looking at the menstrual cycle itself, it's a big marker of health, and I know that that doesn't come up a lot in conversation. But if you have a regular menstrual cycle, then we know that the endocrine system is healthy. We know that you're able to be stress resilient, you're able to take on higher loads, you're able to recover from that. And the whole goal of doing some kind of fitness training is to adapt and get fitter and stronger. And if you have a regular unperturbed cycle, then that's a really good marker. And when you start seeing missteps within it, then there's an ability to pull back before you go over the edge into injury, illness, and not being able to actually rear it back. And the taboo-ness around talking about the menstrual cycle is so endemic. Outside of my bubble, I realize how much people don't talk about it. But if we're looking at, you know where you are in your cycle and what days you feel really good and what days you don't feel that fantastic, you can periodize your training according to your cycle. And we also know from emerging research that in the low hormone phase, with estrogen being in isolation, it's really good for building strength and building muscle and having a really robust immune system. So if we're looking at working from a training perspective, we want to be able to periodize our training according to our cycle. If we're looking at an oral contraceptive pill, it's a little bit of a misstep because the first 5 days of the OC, you're very robust. And then for the middle 2 weeks, for each subsequent day that you're on one of the hormone pills, you become less and less resilient to stress. But there is a small amount of time in there where you can really build power because power isn't as fuel depleting as some of the other things. So there's an ability to build power. And then in the placebo pill, you become very resilient to stress again. And then with the IUD, which is what a lot of athletes that I work with tend to go to because it's a fit and forget, you can still track your cycle. So you still have the ability to understand where you are in your cycle, how you're responding, if you are staying out of low energy availability, staying away from relative energy deficiency in sports. So you're able to keep markers on your health as well.
So one of those big spots being, just to summarize, those blind spots, including women having awareness of their own cycles and how to optimize. I imagine there's probably a lack of awareness in even what impacts those different contraceptives can have on
Yes.
training overall.
Exactly.
Personally, I've never had a doctor have that discussion with me to say, like, this is better for your gains.
Yeah, no. And I mean, I know, and that's one of the other things is I work with Olympic powerlifters. And they're on an oral contraceptive pill and they'll put on muscle mass but no equivalent strength. So we start looking at it and it's the estrogen dose. So if it's a 30 microgram dose, they'll put on more muscle mass because of the estrogen, but there's no representative strength improvement with that. So it's not functional muscle. And they drop down to a 20 microgram or they get off it, then they're able to improve strength, power without necessary hypertrophy, but they're able to stay within their weight class and be stronger. So there's lots of nuances of how women respond, especially what kind of pill they're on and what the estrogen component is, if the progestin component is more androgenic, so it has more of testosterone derivative. Some women want that because they have a lower testosterone and lower ability to produce power. So it's really, if you have to be on an OC, let's find the right one that's appropriate for you and what you want to do. But ideally, we don't want you to be on an OC because we know that overall there is significant impairment to performance and body composition gains.
Well, there's so many follow-on questions I could ask, but I'll refrain because we want to have Q&A at the end. So, Michael, I'll extend the same question to you. What do you think are the biggest blind spots when it comes to training female tactical athletes?
I actually think it's more of a software and communication lens. The coaches that do it, they're almost overwhelmed and they don't have the platform to communicate. So I want to teach my women, which is kind of taboo because I'm the male coach, talking about like your cycle.
Well, I think we defeat that when,
True.
You've been coaching me for 3 years, but go on.
True, but like that initial consult is the male to be like, hey, tell me about your cycle. There has to be a time and place where you earn the trust. And I think a lot of male coaches don't have authentic education in it. And so it's hard to build that trust. And then without the software, because my female tactical athletes will deploy. My male tactical athletes deploy as well. So if I'm using an Excel sheet, which is what your typical Thor 3 or HP program uses, I can't keep in contact. So, I think a huge limiting factor is honestly the technology that is employed to empower people to stay fit while deployed, or TDY, because a lot of my tactical athletes, tier 1 and tier 2, every 2 weeks they're going somewhere. And so it's, hey, how do we maintain good comms? How do we maintain tracking of data? Do you use natural cycles as an app? How are we tracking this? And if we don't have the technology readily available, then it doesn't matter how smart you are, you can't use it. You can't actually employ your intelligence to help your athletes out. So I think the big limiting factor is coaches with education and then the tools needed to actually help their clients and their athletes.
And so part of what you're really advocating in a big way too, I think, is an interaction that's personal and based on a relationship with the individual, as opposed to being assigned an en masse program, which, in sharing an anecdotal situation, when I first entered into special operations, what I was met with when I asked for an individualized program was a blanket program. And it really was launched on an app. It was on an app interface, but there wasn't a whole lot of opportunity for me to ask for adjustments or anything with my coach, which was a concern for me, not only for the female cycle aspects, but also I had just had some operations and really needed that individual attention.
Yeah, I really think it comes down to communication. I mean, if you have just a blanket program, hey, my goal is this. Hey, I'm preparing for this school. I need to do something very different versus just, hey, I just need to maintain my readiness for an ACFT. There's different approaches to that. And then if I can't hear from you, hey, I had a really rough night, my dog was sick and I didn't sleep because my puppy was up all night. It's like, okay, well, let's make some modifications for the week. If it's just, here's your 6-week program, then you don't really get an individualized approach. And then the communication aspect, being able to message your coach. And I'm not to try and toot my own horn or whatever, but I maintain constant communication with over 100 people at any given day, and it doesn't burn me out. So the idea that a coach can't have 30 clients that are all over the world, that's not really the case anymore. Technology is incredible. And with AI kicking in, and AI is now getting implemented into program design, it should be really easy for coaches to be able to maintain good communication with their clientele.
It sounds like a call to action, coaches. You have your marching orders.
Yeah.
So I will present the next question to Michael first this time. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions that coaches have regarding training female tactical athletes?
Essence, really. How does one adapt to training? A lot of the times we're just like, hey, here's your 5x5 bench press at 65%. We're going to use something we call Prelipin's chart. And it doesn't always work that way for somebody that has a different androgen profile. So for women, in my experience, most of my women would adapt better if they're given what I call density. So it's like bench press, rest a minute, push-ups, rest a minute, chest medicine ball throw, rest 3 minutes, maybe a French contrast method style of training. But that density seems to work really well for a lot of my female tactical athletes. And then also, I think another misconception is knowing when you should be training for intensity. It's like, well, we're just going to do intensity every Friday. It's like, well, yeah, but this time of the month, she shouldn't be doing intensity. She should be doing easy percentage work, and she should be, getting a little bit of a mini deload, really. And so the misconception that, we train them the same, the hormone profile is not the same. So you actually do need to track that as a coach. And so I think that's that. And then the idea of program design. And then lower body wise, I still see the same. There's something that I call neuromuscular efficiency. So even though technically you shouldn't be able to do a lot of reps at 90% of your 1 rep, I see a lot of women, that can do 10, 11 reps at 90% of their 1 rep max. So if I just give them 2 reps at 90 because some chart says, hey, this is what we're supposed to do based on this data from collegiate male athletes, that doesn't apply to a female tactical athlete. And so knowing their neuromuscular efficiency or their NME, you can test that in the gym. I don't know of anything peer-reviewed that's ever really studied that in depth, but there's not enough money in strength and conditioning research to really dig into that stuff because it costs a lot of money. So knowing their NME allows me to go, okay, well, you know what, I need to give them clusters, or I need to change, the volume, or, they need to do like 8x5 instead of 5x5 with minimal rest or something along those lines. And I think the program design aspect is, it's like, hey, if it worked for this group of people in this study, 21 to 23 years of age, male, college age, they haven't lived life, they don't really have real stressors, they're in college, versus a platoon leader that's managing so much, or a company commander, that's a whole different ballgame. So I think also just taking into consideration the nervous system and how the nervous system is going to control everything downstream. And the tactical athlete has way more going on in life than, sophomore in college. Mm-hmm. So I think all of that kind of combined, and then again, just making sure that you have good communication. I think coaches constantly think it's fire and forget. And I think coaches get wrapped up in that because we are so embedded in fitness. It's like I can just show up to the gym and do whatever I want because I live in the gym. But people don't live in the gym, so programming cannot be fire and forget. It's like, hey, how'd that feel? Okay, great. Give me an after-action review in 2 days so I can keep tracking that. So I think that's another misconception is things are fire and forget, and they never are.
Yeah, there are a couple things that you mentioned that really merge the concept together for me when you're talking about this neuromuscular efficiency and really just what on any given day is individually available to the athlete to give in the gym.
Yeah.
Some coaches would argue, if this female athlete can perform 15 reps at 90% of their 1 rep max, then it's not a real 1 rep max and you should test again. I don't necessarily agree with that. And really a big part of why Valkyrie Project has employed the RPE model is based on the assumption that any given day, 100% available feels different. Mm-hmm. A day after I've been in the field and without food and stressed out for a week straight, the 100% I have after returning from the field is very different from the 100% after I got 8 hours of sleep and I didn't have a puppy emergency in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
Right? And so that flexibility has to be built in. And I agree, I think it's a mistake to be overly prescriptive in hitting certain percentages, especially when we're talking about a really dynamic population.
Yeah, percentages are all based on elite level athletes. Even structural balance percentages are based on people that are high level dedicated athletes that their life is the gym. When you have more than just that going on in life, you can't have percentages because your 1 rep today may be 200 kilos and your 1 rep tomorrow might be 120 kilos. If I give you 90% at 200, it's going to kill you. It'll blow your back out, or it'll cause so much stress that you become amenorrheic and you have all these other issues. And so it has to be an RPE. I typically give intent and I give rep ranges. So, hey, this is how it should feel. You really shouldn't feel anything beyond this. But I think that comes back to the last point, communication and the software available. So they, my women can look at that and be like, oh, I know exactly what I should feel like today. Great. And I know my terminal cutoff. If I'm starting to die off here, I just need to call it a day and go for a walk.
Right. And I think there's an aspect here too, if we're talking semantics, about a lot of people refer to tactical athletes as professional athletes. I've heard this kind of cued on during a number of different fitness, holistic fitness presentations where they say, well, you guys should be, you're professional athletes, treat yourselves like professional athletes. And it's a nice sentiment, but at the end of the day, a professional athlete is getting paid to do 2-a-days and getting paid to sleep 10 hours a night and getting paid and really given a team of experts to say, eat this at this time and this amount, and those resources simply just aren't there for our community. Totally. And so we have to be realistic in adapting all of those things for our athletes.
It's more like an age group athlete, an elite age group athlete who has to deal with all the stuff and still perform on the stage.
And so what do you mean by age group athlete?
So if you're looking at some of the endurance sports or even some of the regular competitions, you'll have the sub-elite, and the sub-elites are those who have full-time jobs, they have kids, they have all the other responsibilities, but yet they are still performing at a high level on the world stage. But then the next tier up are all the professionals who have everything wrapped up around them. And so it's just this sub-tier of elite who are working just as hard, and they don't have all the accommodations to help them recover properly. So that's where, you look at the differences, like a tactical athlete, I would fit there, where they have all these other stressors that's going to affect things like heart rate variability, sleep patterns, ability to take on load, immunity. And a lot of times they're not looked at that way. They're looked at, okay, your job is to be as fit as possible. And we know that that is not taking into account all these other stressors that affect the way that you can take on load.
And certainly there's a lot to unwrap that we probably don't have time for today, but in terms of sports specificity, right? Like a professional athlete would generally have a very narrow set of skills.
Absolutely.
And the scope, I think, for tactical athletes is unique in that sense,
Yeah.
between running, ruck marching, push-ups, upper body strength, and just a general global universal resilience that is kind of unmatched in other arenas, I think, of sport.
Yeah. I did want to mention that Brad Schoenfeld right now is doing some work specific for women, because we had some conversations. We know that women do better in power training, and which is why you're finding success with cluster sets and different rep ranges and different recovery, because women are less fatigable and they need a higher dose on a more regular basis. So look for that.
Can we crack that open a little bit more?
Sure.
This is exciting. I'd like to hear more about that, less fatigable and...
If we look at basic muscle physiology, women have more mitochondria within, or more proteins within the mitochondria of their muscle that allow them to use free fatty acids. We also don't rely as heavily on muscle glycogen. We rely more on blood glucose. So we also know this is why women do better in a fed state. So never have a woman come fasted to the gym, never go and try and do a run fasted, because it increases cortisol, it increases a cascade of things that won't let you adapt very well. When we look from a neuromuscular standpoint, because the central nervous system is different than men's, then the firing rate is a little bit slower. So we know that women's firing rate is a little bit slower, but their recovery rate is faster. So if we're looking at doing 5x5, and normally we say, the 3 to 5, 3 minutes, 3 sets, 5, so you're having all the same time. And that's how you're supposed to build power. But for women, we know that if you're doing cluster sets and you're doing 5x5 clusters instead, you get a better response, because the recovery time between the heavy loads is shorter, but you end up with a higher dose. Because instead of doing 5x5, you might be doing, a set of 6 cluster, and then a set of 5, and then a set of 6 cluster, and a set of 5. So you get a higher dose and less recovery, and you adapt faster that way. So that's why when we're looking at intensity across the menstrual cycle, or intensity across the hormone profile, there are days where women can really nail it, and the next day nail it, because it's that dose response, and the body's naturally responding to the fact that they need a higher dose for that same intensity to get the adaptations.
That's fascinating. I hope everyone wrote that down. That's exciting. And so now that I've officially taken us on a tangent, I'll give you an opportunity if you would like to weigh in on the question about misconceptions around training female TAC athletes.
I think the biggest misconception is that they can respond the way that male training dictates, right? And we see things like the generalized programming, right? And Mike's talked about this, and it doesn't work. And when we're trying to get the best out of women, it's a combination of them understanding how their hormones affect them, talking to the coach, being able to do the manipulations, doing the micro-periodization within the menstrual cycle, understanding the days where they can hit it really hard, because the goal is to push and get that stress to adapt to it. So it is taking the individualized approach, but through a female lens. Because even things like a lot of the apps that are out there and wearables, they are still based on cis male data. And so it doesn't take into account that after ovulation, your autonomic nervous system changes. So your resting heart rate is going to be higher, your HRV is going to be lower. So if you're looking at it, then it looks like, oh, you're not recovered. But if you understand your own cycle and you're not paying attention to what that app says, you can still push. And if you have that conversation with your coach and you understand your own body, then again, you're going to be able to get more out of training in the gym and more out of what you want out of that training session than if you were to pay attention to what the wearable is telling you or a blanket protocol.
So it certainly sounds like a call to action, not only for coaches, but for individual women as well, right?
Absolutely.
To educate yourself on what those impacts mean. And really that goes back to an ability for self-advocacy, which is so important, especially sometimes in systems that feel resource constrained, and you gotta really put the doc on their toes when you go to see them. Like, I'm not settling for that answer. I want something different, and if you can't give me something different, I'll get a second opinion. Mm-hmm. Definitely, self-advocacy is a thing that I feel passionate about, and certainly, this is a lesson for folks out there that aren't tracking it. It's time to start tracking and understand your body. Yeah. I'll move on to the next question. This one is for Stacy first this time. Stacey, what can industry leaders and female service members be doing to give female TAC athletes even more of an edge in performance?
Oh my gosh, that's a hard one because there's so many things. Where do I start?
Maybe the things we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, I know. When I look at it, I often tell people that everything that they know, again, comes from that male lens. And you need to take that step back and say, well, how does this actually apply to me? How does this apply to the population I'm working with? And most of the time, you take that step back and you realize, hey, wait, none of this does. So how am I going to maneuver things to really empower women? And that's what it's about. So as a leader or in a leadership role, if someone's like, I just can't do that today. I just can't do that today. The general response really is, well, harden up. Why not? But if we look from the female lens, it's like, okay, well, maybe she's a day after ovulation. Maybe I'm not going to have that conversation. But when I'm working with coaches or I'm working with people who are like overseeing a group, it's like, don't make one judgment call based on one day. Because women are very variable. We are not algorithms. So it's understanding that variability and not taking the hard-nosed approach. And being more, as we've all talked about, being more individual in that approach and allowing for that. Because if we give women the power to understand their cycle and understand what's going on, and they always feel flat on a particular day, then that negative self-talk that so many people get into of, I'm not good enough, I'm not fit enough, I can't do this, goes away. So if you are in a leadership position or you're working with a group of women and you can express that and say, hey, we are, as Shay's so apt to say, only human, but we understand the variances within ourselves, then we're not going to make that one judgment call on that one day.
Thank you for that. Michael, what do you think? What do you think industry and individual female service members can be doing to improve their performance overall?
From the coach lens or the athlete lens?
How about both?
So from the coach lens, stop projecting your bias of what a human is capable of. So just completely remove your bias. I can't run a 4-minute mile, but I know people can. So why would I ever tell anybody you can't do that? Like, I've never gone to ranger school, but I know people have. So who am I to say that's not possible? So coaches need to stop projecting their biases. And then from the athlete lens, start writing excuses for success. I have found that to be hugely impactful. Because we all come up with things like, I got to get better at this, I got to get better at that, I got to get better at that. And that's a growth mindset. And we should be like, how can I get better? But sometimes you get so caught up in getting better, you're subconsciously self-limiting your own success because you're like, well, I can't do that until I have these 3 things. It's like, no, just shut up and go do that thing. You're already good enough. Like pull-ups. It's like, I had a female that was struggling with that. Well, why can you do a pull-up? Go journal, handwrite 37 reasons and let your brain get into the creative process of why are you already good enough? So as coaches, if we stop projecting our bias and stop telling people like, oh, I don't know, that's going to be a really tough goal, you should just be like, yeah, let's roger up. Let's go. Let's see what you got. Let's push it. And then good communication. And then from there, give the athletes, an opportunity to journal. Like, hey, handwrite 37 reasons why you are totally good enough for Ranger School. And then remember that KPIs are just indicators of performance. They're not.
Can you explain KPI?
Yeah, key performance indicators. So like a KPI is a key performance indicator. 5-mile run, 35 minutes, 12-mile ruck for 55 pounds dry. You want that in 2:30. I want you to have 80 push-ups in 2 minutes or 57 push-ups in 2 minutes and 80 sit-ups and blah, 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 blah. I've seen plenty of people pass selection, not crushing KPIs. And I've seen plenty of people kill it in the KPI realm and not get selected. And so I work with some of the cadre over at SFAS and the Q course. And the one thing they taught me was we don't pick the best guy in their words. Like, we don't pick the best soldier, we pick the right soldier. Mm-hmm. So if your 2-mile is 15, but you're the right person for the job, you can always go run and get faster, but the person that runs a 12:30, who is just not a team player, we don't want them. So like, who cares if you're the most fit person? So I think one of the things is to also just remember that it's so much more than just what is your ruck time. You're worth more than that. And so when we get caught up in those things, it's like, well, I'm not going to be good enough for Ranger School because I can't do heavy farmer walks, and I can't do this, and I can't do that. And it's like, well, why can you do all these things? And I work with a lot of athletes from that mindset lens, and I love the growth mindset and like Carol Dweck stuff on that, but sometimes you get caught up in that. And I think that's one of the big things that needs to kind of like get looked at and be like, hey, you're good enough, let's go.
I really appreciate that, honestly. And your comment about, selecting not the best person, but the right person, I think ties into a broader narrative that's really important to acknowledge that I think has gone unacknowledged for a while in especially Department of Defense circles, that especially as Shay and Kristen donned their Ranger tabs, and as women are donning the Green Beret, and as women are continuing to break down these barriers and into formally closed jobs and opportunities, there are lots of trolls on the internet that will come out and say, well, universally men are stronger than women, or this or that, and really it feels a bit like a battle of the sexes conversation. And what I would personally like to see happen is having that narrative turned on its head, where when we're talking about military circles, it's not a battle of the sexes, who's better, men or women. It's who can put on the uniform and serve at a time when we are in a recruitment crisis and we are essentially peaking into an era of competition with powerful competitors that are increasingly, gaining new technology and techniques just like we are. So I would challenge everyone, before we transition to Q&A, I would challenge everyone watching at home and in the room to be an advocate for turning that narrative on its head. And this isn't about a battle of the sexes. This is about how do we get each able-bodied person that wants to be a warfighter, how do we get them to be the best that they can be and be all that they can be, now that that's back. I love it. I love it. Perfect. So I think it's a good time to transition to Q&A, and I'd like to invite everyone at home that's watching, in case you didn't find it, there is an opportunity for you to fill out a form on the webpage, so you can submit a question, and Carlin, our MC, will be monitoring those questions, so we'll take questions from online as well, so please submit those. But we'll also take questions from the room. We do have a mic set up here in the corner, so as you have a question, just feel free to go stand up, and if we have to queue up a little bit, that's fine. We want to get to everybody with the time we have left.
Thank you for this lovely conversation. My question is about middle-aged women. So regardless of industry, women battle discrimination, et cetera, they make it to the top, and then they reach perimenopause.
Yes.
Yes.
And for me, I see perimenopause as the women's Q course. And
From what I've been reading, it really sounds like a Q course, and not all women make it out alive, in a sad sense. And so my question is, as we see flag officers, female flag officers who are reaching this moment in time, what is your recommendation of how they should posture themselves ahead of perimenopause, and when they're already in it, what they should be doing?
How much time do we have?
I think we got about half an hour left, right? So we want some other questions too, though.
Yeah, okay. So when we're looking at perimenopause, what we're seeing really is this change in the ratios of estrogen and progesterone. And we know that those two sex hormones affect every system of the body. And just being aware that your training and nutrition and everything isn't going to do what it used to. And this is one of the biggest things when women are getting into their early 40s, they're like, I don't understand what's going on. I'm losing lean mass, putting on belly fat. I can't sleep. I have brain fog. I'm going crazy. No one's talking about it. If you go to a physician, they'll be like, oh, you're just highly stressed. Here's a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And that's not going to solve the problem at all. Well, SSRI might help a little bit with hot flashes, but for the most part, we have to take charge and understand that there are two major factors that we need to consider. One is our gut microbiome, because when we start having changes in our sex hormones, we start having a massive change in the diversity of our gut. Because when our body naturally produces sex hormones, they go to the liver and are bound up with sex hormone binding globulin, and then excreted into the intestines, and then they're unbound by our gut bugs. So when we have less and less progesterone, then we're starting to lose that diversity, and we're also seeing an increase in the gut bacteria that creates obesity and illness. So first and foremost, when you start going through perimenopause, making sure that you're having as much of a diversity of fibrous fruit and veg that you can in order to knock that change on its head. The other is when we look at training and nutrition. Women are really good at going long and slow. Like I said earlier, we're less fatigable. If we spend a lot of time in moderate intensity, we don't get adaptation. Matter of fact, we increase our sympathetic drive because we're already at a higher baseline of cortisol when you're going through perimenopause, and you don't want to push that up and increase that sympathetic drive, because then you're not going to get into a parasympathetic ability to sleep, relax, mindfulness, any of that. So we have to really look at polarizing our training. So we're dropping volume significantly, and we're going for that really high intensity sprint interval training, high intensity work, heavy resistance training, focusing on the power and the movement, and we're not looking at volume. We're looking at that polarization and really doing both ends of the spectrum to stay out of that moderate intensity, which then feeds forward to an increase in post-exercise growth hormone, post-exercise testosterone, and delayed but a really essential parasympathetic response. So if we work on the training and we work on the gut, then it makes the transition through perimenopause not as significantly impactful, although every woman's experience is going to be different. But from a general standpoint, those are the two big rocks that we really need to pay attention to. And then if we're having things like mood, anxiety, we can look at using adaptogens. We can look at using a little bit of menopause hormone therapy if it's required as a therapy to get through things, but not as the be-all, end-all. Because we also know that menopause hormone therapy doesn't stop what's going on. It just slows the rate of change. So I'll stop there.
So, while we're pointing out calls to action, right, we talk about needing to retain female service members. I think that this is another area of blind spots that coaches could really be paying attention to, especially because we acknowledge and understand that signature matters. And for people like Shay, that we're the first to put on the Ranger tab gives a signal to everyone else that I can do it too. And it's really important to see women in senior leadership positions in the military to not only mentor and coach subordinates, but to create that signature that this is possible, and we want people to see likeness. And so with that, it's important for coaches to understand, when they've got these senior enlisted NCOs and officers that we want to keep around, the coaches have to understand these concepts.
Absolutely.
By the way, everyone, please, if you have a specific panelist you would like to direct your question at, please say so. If not, we'll just open it generally. Did you want to add anything?
I was going to say I do a lot of higher intensity and a lot of reciprocal of that. So, the reciprocal of intensity is kind of volume, but I make the volume so much easier that it's kind of like mindlessness. If I tell you to go for a walk, you don't have to focus on your feet. And so any type of volume I give would be something like that. And then from the intensity lens, I make it intense. And then as a male coach too, I try to empathize with my women that are going through that because I'll never go through that. So I try to just open the door to be like, hey, I understand what you're going through. It can be tough. I do have a physician that I work with that specializes in this exact field, and I try to refer out for that one. And then I just try to offer as much possible empathy and support because I know that it can be a very turbulent time from an emotional standpoint as well. But the intensity thing I found to be hugely successful over the years.
And thank you for setting that role model for other coaches. We appreciate that.
Yeah.
Next question.
Good morning. Dr. Sims, it's wonderful to see you. I wish I'd brought my book for you to sign. My question is about balancing cardio and strength training, specifically in reference to training for the Army Combat Fitness Test.
Yeah, that one's often hard. When we look at it, it's, again, the big rock is the resistance, right? So if we're looking at how are we staying strong on the back half of something when we're really tired, we need that strength from what we've done in the gym. So we always put the basis on the strength component, and even through cardiovascular work, what kind of strength component are you going to put through the cardiovascular work? But even as you're building and looking to periodize through it, you have that basis of strength, and then you can top end it on the cardio. And as I've been saying before, women are really resilient and have the ability to go long and slow. So again, it's the polarizing. So if you want to get faster, you have to do some more of the intensity, but you have to have the strength in order to be resilient to do the intensity. So it's the strength and then a little bit of cardio and then refocus of strength and cardio together.
Thank you. Yep. Would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I would say whenever you're training for something, coaches sometimes forget that the thing you're training for is the test. We're not trying to give you the test. I'm trying to train you to get into a fight. I'm not training you to feel like you just got into a fight. So your intervals for, the 2 mile, for example, we want sustainability. So if you're running 800s and you're having die off, it's 4 minutes, 4:35. That's fatigue-based training, and that's not going to lend to long-term success. And so even if you're doing high-intensity intervals, like with track and field athletes, an 800-meter sprint take you about 15, 20 minutes to recover from if you go all out. Like a world-class sprinter will take a long time to recover from that. And there's a point in time where we want to peak that. So don't try to maintain, absolute sprint performance for the ACFT. But if you maintain sustainability in your conditioning and you're adding strength, you can kind of do both. And a great example of that is just look at women in CrossFit. Some of the strongest women out there, and they can run 18-minute 5Ks, 3 miles. I've had women run 13-minute 2 miles, but they can deadlift 300 pounds. But it takes a lot longer because it's going to be, we're going to build your strength, and then we're also going to slowly give you the aerobic base. But the aerobic base is huge, and that comes from just being really sustainable and not letting yourself have that die off. So if you're running intervals and every interval is getting slower and slower, you're digging yourself a fatigue-based, rabbit hole. And there's a time and place for that, for sure, but it should not be all the time. So if you're finishing your workouts feeling like you just got crushed every time, you need to start looking at your pacing. And then for the ACFT, just practice the ball throw. I don't know how else to describe that. Everyone is good enough at that, but it's like, just go do the ball throw. There's no training for that. Go deadlift, use the ball throw as a warm-up. I give the ball throw to everyone as a warm-up, and it works. Everyone here's probably done that, right? It's 1 inch later and you've just completely bombed it. So just practice it, really. That's what it comes down to.
It just feels so silly, too. It hurts my pride to do that.
It's like the Marine Corps with their grenade throw, It's just come on.
Got to do what you got to do. Yeah. Carlin, do we have any questions from online that we can pose for the panelists yet?
We do. Our first is, hey from the UK. How would you like to see the messages you're highlighting shared and heard by women in the military?
How would I like to hear
the messages that you're highlighting shared and heard by women in the military?
I can take this one.
That's a good one.
I would like to invite everyone to send up the demand signal for this type of performance attention in their holistic human performance programs among their commands. We do intend to produce a white paper after we've gone through all the panels, and we'll take the recording and congeal everything down and make sure the appropriate citations have a home there. And you can reach out to us for a copy of that whenever it's done. Give us a few weeks because we've had our hair on fire planning this event, but we do intend to produce that. And that's an invitation not only for women to make the demand of that level of attention and care from their individual trainers. Don't be afraid to ask your trainer to account for your cycle in your training. And if they can't, then that is a signal that they need some more training potentially as a coach. But also to send that demand signal up to your leadership and commands. And simultaneously, I would invite anyone that has influence in the Department of Defense here and abroad. By the way, we've got folks from the UK in the room, which is outstanding. Thank you for being here. Send the demand signal up, and really I would call senior leadership, I would challenge senior leadership to take a hard look in the mirror and ask yourself the hard question if you're actually doing everything you can to empower every weapon system, which is a man or woman or whomever in your formation, right? If you're not investing fully in every weapon system, then you're doing a disservice to the organization and the future of the force. And so that also means untying all of these negative emotions related to taboos, right? We, as leaders in the military, are accustomed to having resources available when soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines come into our offices and say, I'm having a bit of a mental health crisis. I can't counsel you, but I know exactly who you need to talk to. Here's 7 different phone numbers. I'm going to check on you every day for the next 3 weeks till I make sure that you got what you need. I'm having a family crisis where, financial emergency, what have you, right? We have all these resources for service members, but it should be the same when a female service member comes in and says, sir or sergeant or ma'am, my menstrual cycle is cripplingly painful and I can't function. You don't have to have the answer, but you certainly have to take ownership of that person and say, here's some resources for you. Or at least to say, you want to go to Ranger School, or you want to go out for SFAS, or you want to go out for Air Force Special Tactics. I'm going to, first, we all know the mission has to come first, right? And observe what the unit's got going on before we can just hand out trainings in school, right? That there's a piece that requires some judgment there, right? But commanders and senior NCOs shouldn't be blocking female service members from opportunities to compete because they are projecting their own biases about, I don't think you can do that because you're a woman, but that's an arbitrary reason, right? So we owe it to our service members to give those resources and to facilitate their career development, especially if we want to keep them, and especially if we are invested in their longevity. Thanks. All right. Do we have time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the mic over here.
Hi, my question is, how often do you recommend women getting blood work to understand where they may be deficient in some of their hormones and supplementing that? I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that and how it affects performance.
When you're getting blood tests, it's just a representative of one point in time. So you really want to look at tracking. And we know that if you want to find out what's happening with estrogen, it's a day 2 test, so second day of bleeding, and for progesterone, it's around day 21. And you just want to find the trends. We usually look at it for someone who's trying to establish, are they having issues? Are we having a decrease in their luteinizing hormone pulse because there's perturbance in their menstrual cycle? Then we do blood tests for 3 subsequent cycles. If we're looking for some kind of deficiency, then it's really every 6 months and seeing and tracking. And then if you are deficient, then there are definitely options for supplementing. Unfortunately, a lot of the times, really athletic women will be on the low end of normal of things, especially iron. And they're always suffering because the low end of normal isn't normal for them. So then they're not going to get medical help for supplementation. But if you understand that if you're on the low end of normal for iron, there are ways of boosting it if you're looking at supplementing around your menstrual cycle, where you're supplementing every other day during the follicular phase because hepcidin's low. And we know that hepcidin, when it comes up, it inhibits iron absorption. Same with creatine. We're seeing better efficacy for creatine absorption in the luteal phase after ovulation. So there are different ways of supplementing as well. So it's first, okay, every 6 months, see what's going on if you are deficient in something. If you're trying to establish hormone balance, then that's a cyclical thing for every three months. That's how we do it, but I know that Michael has a vast background in endocrinology and holistic health, so he might have some other suggestions.
Yeah, I always do it when I get stumped. So if you don't have the basics figured out, like if you're not prioritizing sleep, when you can. I mean, I know mission dictates some things and you got to go sleepless sometimes, but if you're Garrison and you're just kind of like a 9 to 5 and you're not going to bed on time and you're not, trying to optimize your food, I'll usually start there before I start going down rabbit holes. But as for blood work, I take a very adaptive physiology approach. So there's pathophysiology and then there's adaptive physiology. Pathophysiology is kind of like, hey, you just got the flu, your body's going to have an adaptation to this virus and it's going to have a bunch of stuff happen. I take the adaptive physiology approach because I'm not looking for malignancy, I'm looking for performance like inhibitors. So I'll do everything from a CBC with differential, which is basically your white blood cells and your red blood cells and all that stuff. I'll look at a CMP, which is kidney and liver function. That has a lot to do with potential hormone disruption. So I like to ask the question, why? Like I'm pretty much a professional toddler. I'm just gonna ask why 17 times. Like, why are you feeling like this? Okay, but why? But why? But why? But why? And then from there, I'll run blood work every 4 to 6 weeks, even if it's something as simple as just a CBC. I just wanna see what your immune system is doing, because if your white blood cells are at 3, something is going on. It's like blood pressure, all right? Your blood pressure is 190 over 100. I can't tell you why, but I need to ask some questions and we need to kind of like talk about this and at times refer out. So I'll run blood work quite frequently, especially in today's day and age where you can get blood work wholesale online for $30. You don't have to go to a doctor. You don't have to go to the PA, on base. You just go off post and pay $30 and you get your panel done. It's so easy now. And the results come faster. When I do it through the civilian route, I get results in like 72 hours.
All right, sounds good.
Cool. So yeah, I get the results in 48 to 72 hours, but how long does it take, like, in the Marine Corps, BAS, right? Like you go to your battalion aid station, 2 weeks later, you finally know what your white blood cells are like. And so I prefer the civilian route, but I do it quite frequently. And then again, I look at the systems, so I call them emunctories. So they're systems of elimination, right? So your liver and your gut, that's huge. Your kidneys, your lungs, your nervous system, your emotional system is a part of that. And we look at some of the epidemiology data, there's a lot of diseases that seem to pop up around airports. Well, there's a lot of pollution there. So we do have some data in internal medicine that talks about disease and all sorts of hormone issues from that. Well, when you live on a military base, every 10 seconds there's a helicopter flying by, right? Like if you're a pilot, you're constantly exposed to things that are not good for your body. Like our evolution, like we didn't evolve to inhale these things because we have to get rid of it somehow. Nothing is infinite on the planet. And so we don't have infinite methyl groups. We don't have infinite blah, 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 blah. So I run blood work frequently to figure out where we might be kind of deficient. And then I come up with a game plan to kind of adjust for that. So it could be every 6 weeks. It can be every 6 months. Deep panels, probably twice a year. But then from there, it's like little check-ins, little litmus tests is, hey, are we trending in the right direction here? Are we moving in the way that we should be? And that's how I do it. But again, I work in like a one-on-one model, so it's N equals 1 times 1,000.
And now we're talking about math, and you lost me. No, I'm kidding. And honestly, I think that brings up another, I'll continue to pin these sort of calls to action, but honestly, these holistic programs, there's an opportunity in this, right? Especially if you've tried all the mastering the basics of getting 10 colors of fruits and vegetables every day, and sufficient protein, and sufficient sleep, and sufficient water, and reducing your environmental exposure as much as possible, like, not smoking, unfortunately, the pilots will have to continue to breathe in the fuel fumes, but it is what it is.
There's things you can do for that too, right? Like
right.
There are things you can do to kind of help offset that a little bit. There's data out there on saunas and detoxification now. So I've seen women's hormones improve by just doing some simple stuff like that, like castor oil packs. I've seen that actually help a cycle out quite a bit, many times. Biotherapeutic drainage, stuff that we've talked about in the past. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things you can do, even though you're exposed to things. And one of the biggest things is diet. Eat, more than just whatever's at the DFAC.
Yeah, and
just saying.
Yeah, and so really, it's it's a conversation of master the basics first, and then it would be great if in a future world we saw these holistic programs in the different departments employing blood work panels occasionally, because it is very difficult and a time suck to try and get with your PA sometimes, and that blood work would be really revelatory about what's going on.
Yep.
And especially if there can be these physical therapists on site so you can get a same day appointment. Why can't we have a specialist in nutrition that also understands endocrinology that can call blood work and get those answers faster for our service members? That'd be fantastic.
I think the other thing too that needs to change is reference intervals. When you get blood work,
Yes.
we look at reference intervals. That's not optimal. No. So if your glucose is 99, the reference interval might be 70 to 100. You're good. You're within normal limits. You're trending towards diabetes. Like, let's be real about that, right? So it's like, well, yeah, 99 is fine, but 100 is pre-diabetic. Come on, like you're on the way there. So there's a check engine light on, but there's no funny noise, or vice versa. Funny noise in the car, no check engine light. And so the way that blood work is often done with a lot of mainstream medicine is just, well, the check engine light's not on, so I can't plug in the computer to diagnose it. Come back when the engine's completely blown out. My job is to teach you how to change your oil. If you change your oil every X amount of miles, your engine lasts longer. But once your engine blows out because you didn't pay attention to it, an oil change doesn't fix that. So there needs to be a lot more knowledge around optimal ranges for health and performance versus just reference intervals. Mm-hmm. That's a big one, especially for hormones, big time for hormones.
Yep. That was interesting. Thanks, guys. Can we pull another from online?
Active duty military trying to reintegrate to the armed forces after pregnancy. Any recommendations on how to do this safely?
Reintegrating after pregnancy
Postpartum.
safely?
Yeah.
This one stays.
Oh, postpartum, how long, actually? Because, maternity leave is so different everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So when we're looking what you can do before you actually get to a point where you can reintegrate, it's knowing that you've come from a big injury for the most part. And so we approach the postpartum era as recovering from that injury. So we're looking at the first 6 weeks, you're just trying to move and seeing if there's anything wrong. And the biggest thing is to work with a pelvic floor specialist, because that's the biggest misstep that people don't tell you about. Pelvic floor specialist is essential. And then you start adding things as your body lets you. So then when you're reintegrating into all of the stressors that come with being back into a full job and back into full training, your body's become resilient. So you can slowly start adding things in. But it's not jump in 100% again. It's you've come back from an injury because your body has changed over the course of 10 months. You've had a baby, either C-section or vaginal delivery. It's a massive change. And there are things that people don't tell you about either. So your sit bones widen. So your mechanics are different. So you have to relearn how to run, how to land. All of those different mechanics have changed. So taking your time to understand how your body has changed and how you move after pregnancy before you jump fully back in is so essential, and I don't think that's discussed enough.
And certainly we want to crack that open a little bit more in the life course panel next, so I don't want to delve into that too much, but thank you for that. We'll take one more question from the room.
Thank you. My question is actually on nutrition, and it's for both panelists. To your point about eating more than what's available in the DFAC, sometimes in austere environments and in the field, we don't have those options, and we're stuck with MREs and whatever's in the field kitchen and so forth. So what do women need to know about optimizing our fueling in those situations so we're not working against ourselves?
I would ask, are you deployed or just in the field? Because there's a difference on how I approach that.
So I think I had both in mind, because I know deployed, it's a little bit easier sometimes to get outside fuel sources, but if you're in, say, JRTC and you're just stuck with MREs, that would be the other case.
I treat that like collegiate athletes. Like when I've worked with female soccer players at the D1 level that have to travel a lot, it's the same thing. It just depends on how much you can pack out. Can you take a greens powder? Can you take a fiber supplement? Can you take a B vitamin? Can you take a whey protein with you, or any protein that doesn't cause gastrointestinal upset? So can we take those things out to the field? Because let's be real, like if you have a full pack, like do you want to take a tub of protein and then this and then that? Like it gets overwhelming. So that's how I look at that. I just treat it just like I would if it was a collegiate athlete traveling. That's my big one. Because I mean, MREs, yeah, if you've eaten MREs, they're not going to be the most nutritious, and they can back you up. And so fiber, the ones that I've had the most success with, fiber, specifically it's a brand called Designs for Health, Paleo Fiber. I've had great success with that. And then Greens First, which is a greens powder that actually tastes pretty good. It doesn't taste like wheatgrass. And then whey protein. Those three, I usually have good success with that.
Yeah, I was going to say protein, because protein is so critical, especially if you're having changes in your circadian rhythm. It's really essential for women, not as much as men. And the daily recommendation currently for protein is based on sedentary old men for women. And if you look at, okay, what does a 60-year-old sedentary old man have in common with me, who is very active and has lots of muscle? Nothing. So we know that the recommendation for protein is almost twice of what the RDA says. And that's not necessarily represented. So even traveling, like Michael's saying, you really want to put an emphasis on what is your protein availability. It helps with maintaining satiation, it helps with brain chemistry, neurotransmitters. It helps offset the feeling of fatigue, and it helps with body comp. So those are all really essential when you're away from your general nutrition.
That was a great question.
It was.
Somebody asked that.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. And, certainly we've said it a couple times, but I think this just also illuminates the need for more research, right?
Yeah.
In terms of, doing the studies that relate to female TAC athletes and protein needs and nutrition timing.